Yo Palinganan. Good afternoon. My name is Ruth Kieron and I'm the head of the School of Medicine at the University of Tasmania. Today we're meeting on Lutruwita, Tasmania, Aboriginal land, sea and waterways. I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land, the Muwinina people. The Muwinina people belong to the oldest continuing culture in the world. They cared and protected country for thousands of years. They knew this land, they lived on the land and they died on this land. For the Muwinina people, the area around Nipaluna, Hobart was their country and they called Mount Wellington Kunyani. I acknowledge that it is a privilege to stand on country and walk in the footsteps of those before us. Beneath the mountain, among the gums and waterways that continue to run through the veins of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, I pay my respects to elders past and present and to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status and to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community that continue to care for country. I recognise a history of truth which acknowledges the impacts of invasion and colonisation upon Aboriginal people, resulting in the forcible removal from their lands. And I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future. I have the great pleasure today of welcoming our 2024 Australians of the Year, Professor Georgina Long, AO, and Professor Richard Scolyer, AO, on behalf of the College of Health and Medicine, in particular the Menzies Institute for Medical Research and the many supporters of their work. And I know a number of you are here in our audience today. Also on behalf of the Tasmanian School of Medicine, which is proud to claim Richard as one of its alumni. So that's great. Georgina and Richard are clinicians, researchers, educators, leaders and pioneers, and have worked together as the co-directors of Melanoma Institute Australia to transform the outcomes of people around the world with advanced melanoma, while also focusing on the prevention and early detection of melanoma. Georgina is co-medical director and chair of the Melanoma Medical Oncology and Translational Research at Melanoma Institute Australia, Royal North Shore Hospital and the University of Sydney, and leads an extensive clinical trials team and laboratory with a focus on targeted therapies and immuno-oncology in melanoma. Richard is a senior staff specialist of tissue pathology and diagnostic oncology at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney, and conjunct professor of the Sydney Medical School at the University of Sydney. Through their development of immunotherapy treatments, which activates a patient's own immune system, over the last decade, advanced melanoma has gone from being an invariably fatal disease to a curable disease for many. In June 2023, when Richard was diagnosed with glioblastoma, he and Georgina developed a series of world-first treatments for his cancer based on their melanoma breakthroughs. Richard became the world's first brain cancer patient to have pre-surgery combination immunotherapy. By undertaking an experimental treatment with risk of shortening his life, he has advanced the understanding of brain cancer and is benefiting future patients. I'd like us to warmly welcome our speakers today, Professor Georgina Long, AO, and Professor Richard Scolyer, AO.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Tracy, and the Australia Day Council here in Tasmania for giving us this wonderful opportunity to speak to such a broad audience today. We're really grateful for that. And we also, before we get going, would too like to acknowledge the Palawa people and the land we're on to today, their elders past and present, and the deep continuing connection of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to the waters, the sky and the land. Thank you.
And Georgina, before we kick off, I'd also, first of all, like to follow up on that mention of me being an alumni from the University of Tasmania. I'm very proud to have gone to medical school down here. It's certainly a lot different to what it was in my day. And I'm seeing many familiar faces in the audience as we go to speak today. So, yeah, thrilled about so many people have come along. And I see, I think I've got this right, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor or Executive of the University, James Groom's here. So thanks for coming along. Grooming used to be a footy buddy of mine back in the day.
So the way we've structured this talk is really to talk about the infrastructure and the way we've approached research, and then finish off on some examples of where we've made a difference. As was mentioned by Ruth, Richard and I are co-medical directors at Melanoma Institute Australia and professors at the University of Sydney. We also run a very large laboratory, translational research laboratory.
The Melanoma Institute Australia is the world's largest melanoma treatment and research centre. We've got an incredible multidisciplinary team of people who are working together to try and achieve a goal of 0 deaths from melanoma.
And in achieving this goal or working towards this, we are having an impact on other cancers as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that.
Australia, as I'm sure many of you are very aware, has the highest incidence of melanoma anywhere in the world. The incidence is obviously higher in North Queensland than what it is in Tasmania, and apologies that Tasmania's dropped off the map there.
Richard! Jeez.
We've had a fight on for this for many years, but in any case, you know this, and that's why we call it Australia's national cancer. It's the second most common cancer in men in Australia and the third most common cancer in women in this country.
It also disproportionately impacts young people. Young people don't tend to get cancer, but if they do in Australia, it is the commonest cancer in 20 to 39-year-olds in Australia.
The incidence goes up over time. In fact, one Australian gets diagnosed with melanoma every 30 minutes, and despite the breakthroughs that have happened over the past 15 years or so, the death rate is still significant. One Australian still dies of melanoma every 6 hours. So we've got a way to go to get to our goal of 0 deaths from melanoma.
We've shaved off an hour off that. So, we've added the hour off that. It used to be 1 in 5 hours, so now it's 1 in 6 hours. So we have 3 pillars of activity at Melanoma Institute Australia. Number 1, clinical care of people with melanoma or complex skin cancer. Number 2, research into melanoma and complex skin cancer. And then the education of health professionals and the broader community regarding melanoma and prevention of melanoma. So there are 3 pillars.
Yeah, we've got an incredible team of people who are working together to get us to this goal. In fact, we've got 28 what we call faculty members, but these are people who are world-renowned experts across many, many disciplines, both clinically and in research, trying to deliver on our goal. We've got 4, Georgina mentioned the 3 pillars of activity that we have: clinical care, research and education. Research is absolutely critical if we're going to get to our goal of 0 deaths. And we've got 4 themes of research activity in our research.
And it follows the journey of the human, basically, from prevention to diagnosis to treatment of metastatic disease. And then a problem we're actually proud of is survivorship and supportive care. So this is an increasing issue that we're facing with people who've had melanoma. And then across all of those 4 themes, we've got health economics. And that's critical because we've got a shared medical system, which we're very proud of here in Australia. And we have to make sure that all of our money, it's our community, it's being well spent to keep our population healthy. So that's a really important part of our research as well.
And we know that skin cancer is the biggest cost to that Australian healthcare budget. So therefore, as taxpayers, if we can do more to prevent this disease and improve outcomes, it will have lasting, worthwhile benefits for all of us in this country.
For every dollar we spend on prevention, so putting us out of jobs, which is what we want, for every dollar spent now, us Australian taxpayers get $4 back over the next few decades. So it is well worth the expenditure to try and prevent the disease altogether.
So if you know politicians, grooming, you've got to sell this message about it. Governments need to invest in prevention because there's a big payback the problem for politicians is that payback doesn't start for a decade or more later. So we've got to get that message through.
This is how we've organised our research amongst those 4 themes. So at the centre of everything we do is the problems we're encountering as clinicians, and that's our multidisciplinary team meeting, which you can see in the middle there. We meet every week for 2 hours. About 70 experts meet to discuss really difficult cases of complex skin cancer or melanoma. But that is where the questions come up that drives our research program. It's also our patients who contribute to our biospecimen bank. It's the largest in the world. The Aussie altruistic spirit is never more so evident in our clinics when we ask people to consent to donating their blood and their melanoma tissue. Our research database, 50,000.
Yeah, world's largest. In fact, it got set up in the early 1960s. I mean, guys.
There's millions of seats down here, by the way. Like, just if you come down here, there's 5 in a row.
So as Georgina mentioned, Australians are incredibly generous about allowing not just us, but across cancer research and indeed medical research, to researchers to collect information about them and therefore conduct research which improves outcomes, treatment of patients moving forward. So donating data about themselves, donating specimens to our biospecimens, which are the 2 largest of their type in the world in melanoma, had a major impact on our research, but also global research in the field.
And with that, then clinical trials. We've got a very large and sophisticated clinical trials unit, from what we call first-in-human studies right up to what we call phase 3 studies, with drug therapies, but also surgical trials, radiotherapy and dermatology trials in melanoma. And that connects well with our biospecimens bank, looking at how tissue changes with novel drug therapies. And then lastly, our laboratories. So Richard and I co-lead a laboratory at the University of Sydney with 30 staff, looking into various aspects of our research program, from diagnosis right up to resistance and response to novel drug therapies. Shall we give an example of translate how this works in the real world?
Well, here's us at our MDT, multidisciplinary team meeting, or tumour board meeting, they like to call them in the United States, where we meet Friday morning, discuss the most challenging problem. As Georgina mentioned, often questions come up that are not straightforward for us about how should this patient be managed, or another question that relates to that particular patient. They've been resistant to drug therapy. What's the cause of that? So this feeds into our research program.
I think a good example was last Friday it's every Friday at our multidisciplinary team meeting. The patient was the first person in the world to go on a first-in-humans trial. I won't talk about the drug therapy, but we saw these incredible changes in his melanoma, and that brought up the question, which we'd never seen before, which were good changes. Why? Why was this happening to this patient's melanoma? And that's now given us questions that we want to explore in the laboratory that'll eventually may have an impact on this drug's development if it's successful, which then gets published, and that is then available for all the scientific world and clinical practice.
Yeah, and ultimately they get included within clinical practice guidelines and other important protocols, guidelines that go about, such as the World Health Organization's classification of skin tumours.
And then that goes back into our multidisciplinary team meeting, because that's a new treatment paradigm. And so it goes around and around with a vicious cycle of hopefully success. So our research output?
We put out a few papers each year. But one thing that we're really proud of, we've used our research not just to put out papers, but to have a big impact for patient care. So in the old days, you'd put out a paper that said a particular factor was a prognostic factor in melanoma, to find out which patients perhaps need treatment and which ones don't. We've now pushed this a lot further and developed risk tools that are publicly available on our website, melanomarisk.org.au, which gets hundreds of thousands of hits by people all around the world to address individual clinical questions, some of which are listed here, but they're actually more available now than what's up on the screen.
One good example, if many of you here have grown up in Australia, you can use the first primary melanoma risk tool at the left. By the way, that's missing an AU at the end of that. That should be AU. And that will tell you, answer a few questions. It will tell you your risk of your first melanoma. If you've already had a first melanoma, you can then go to our other tool, subsequent primary melanoma risk, and work out what your risk of a subsequent new primary is. If you have advanced melanoma, and this is more for clinicians, it helps clinicians choose between different immunotherapy regimens and the chance of people responding. So these are real tools for real life clinics to help manage people with melanoma better.
And Georgina, just as a sideline of what you just brought up, I guess one of the advantages and opportunities that's come about to us as Australians of the Year has been an opportunity to talk to government about problems that we think need to be addressed and haven't been addressed in the past. And one of which is to develop a targeted screening program for high-risk melanoma, people who are at high risk of developing melanoma. It's not something that everyone in Australia should have a skin check, but there's a group of patients who are at much higher risk. So we're working with government to do that, including using these tools.
And then for the rest of the Australians who are not high risk, the best protection from melanoma and skin cancer is knowing the skin you're in. The average Aussie does not need to undergo a regular skin check if they are not at particular risk. They need to know the skin they're in. And it's really important because as all of us trying to make our community healthier, if everybody had a skin check, we actually would not be making a dent on survival from melanoma. By knowing the skin you're in and by screening the high-risk population, that is how we can improve outcomes.
Improve outcomes and the healthcare budget as well.
Just to talk about the stages of melanoma.
Yep. So so for non-medical people, I guess, we group patients into different, what we call stages, American Joint Committee on Cancer staging system, into 4 different stages based on the risk of their disease spreading and ultimately causing death. For melanoma, if you've got what we call a primary tumour on your skin, so it's still clinically localised to the skin, it's stage 1 or stage 2. Stage 2 higher risk than stage 1. Stage 3, when it's spread loco-regionally, so to the regional, if it's on your arm, to the lymph glands underneath the arm or in transit between the two. And stage 4 melanoma, when it's spread elsewhere and throughout your body, different parts.
So when we're talking about early melanoma, it's really important to get the diagnosis right. And that's Richard's expertise as a pathologist.
And we know from our experience, and I know there's some pathologists in the room here today, that most cases of melanoma, that it is an easy diagnosis to make. But compared to many other fields of pathology, a significant proportion of the cases are tough. And at our institute, about 5% of people who are referred in who've been given a diagnosis of melanoma don't actually have melanoma. And we know that there's some patients whose melanoma is missed and there's adverse outcomes as a consequence. Through our research team and through our molecular driven research program, we've developed an AI-based molecular tool to improve the accuracy of diagnosis. In fact, we've got a patent on this and it's soon to be released and utilised in the broad field to improve the accuracy of diagnosis.
So then moving along now to drug therapy. At this point in Australia, we have drug therapies available for very high risk stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4 melanoma. And for stage 2 and stage 3, it's about preventing patients from becoming stage 4. Stage 4, just over a decade ago, was almost universally terminal. It was the cancer you did not want to get, but things have changed with the drug therapies we use in stage 4, which we now routinely use in very, very high risk stage 2 and stage 3. When we're using it in stage 2 and stage 3, we use the word adjuvant. It's an adjunct, it's added after surgery, or neoadjuvant, it's done before surgical removal of the cancer. So the main two drugs that we use at the moment that are standardly available across Australia, this is not clinical trials. These drugs are now available because of the clinical trials we have performed in the last 15 years. So on the left are targeted therapies. These are aimed at an abnormality within the melanoma, approximately 40%. So 4 in 10 melanomas will have this abnormality called a BRAF mutation in the melanoma. And these work very well. And then on the right, we have checkpoint inhibitors, or a type of immunotherapy. And this has revolutionized all of cancer. In fact, these drugs are now the most commonly used drugs in cancer, in lung cancer, kidney cancer, head and neck cancer, bladder cancer, the list goes on and on. But it started in melanoma. Both these patients, the one on the left, you can see the yellow circle highlights a hemithorax full of melanoma. And then the man on the right has lymph nodes with melanoma, but also has melanoma in the liver. 15 years ago, both of these people would have died within about 9 months. The one on the right had a complete response. He's now 11 years down the track and completely cancer-free. The one on the left had about 2 years and then did die. So we do still have a problem. About 45% of patients are still dying from melanoma with advanced melanoma, and that is a big focus of our research. They differ in that targeted therapy kills a melanoma cell directly. Immunotherapy does not. Immunotherapy works on a specific immune cell called a T cell, and the T cell then kills the melanoma cancer cell. Had a lot of success.
Published a few papers, as we mentioned earlier, but these have had a big impact on the field and have really changed cancer, not just in melanoma, but in many other cancers. Recently, there's a very important announcement. Georgina, do you want to talk a bit more about neoadjuvant therapy, or wait for that data?
We've got some slides on that as well. But just to give you a sense of the impact, on the left there are two of my patients, Adam and Josh, and their children, Grace and Mia. And Mia was actually named after Melanoma Institute Australia. So they had stage 4 melanoma in their 30s. Both are fine and well, and they're now well into their 40s. And in fact, Grace, I saw a photo of her the other day. She's 7 years old. And Grace is, 6 years old, and Mia is 7 years old and at school. And then on the right, we have a man who's 102 at birthday, and next to him is my colleague, Alex Menzies, who's a medical oncologist like me. And he was treated at the age of 101. And you think, why would you give drug therapy to 101? Well, he had a melanoma that was very symptomatic. And so to improve his quality of life, Alex tried just 1 or 2 doses of immune therapy. We weren't giving him a full course. The melanoma shrank away, and he lived to the age of 105. And I'm happy to say he did not die of melanoma. He lived at home the whole time independently, and he died peacefully in his sleep.
Another thing that's really been incredible that hasn't been seen in any cancer before is if you look at the survival rate of melanoma, that yellow survival curve up the top, you can see in 2010, 2011, there's a precipitous fall in the death rate from melanoma. And that's a direct consequence of the therapies that Georgina has led the development of and has really massively improved outcomes for people with stage 4 melanoma.
There are many novel drugs in trials that we're working on in the trials unit. For example, I won't go through these in details, but these bispecific T-cell engagers, and this is really focusing on that 45% who don't respond. How can we get their immune system to recognize the tumor as foreign and eradicate it? mRNA technology, in fact, although we used mRNA technology for COVID, both Moderna and BioNTech were working with me in clinical trials at MIA in our unit on cancer. And then COVID came along and they pivoted into COVID. And then we're still doing lots of our drug program involves mRNA. I think I now have 7 mRNA trials, not just personalized vaccine, but other mRNA technology we're using in trial. And this is the thing I mentioned on the last meeting, this patient who's had this incredible outcome with a self-replicating mRNA. So we're building on the knowledge we've gained in the last 10 years. There's a lot of other things we're doing, genetically altered T cells from a patient that we genetically alter and reinfuse, and then antibody drug conjugates, which have a way to go in melanoma, but have really helped things like breast cancer. And this now takes us to the other part of our research, and that's the neoadjuvant or early
before
data.
surgery treatment. And it makes great sense. It certainly does to me as a brain cancer patient. And what we've seen in melanoma is truly incredible. If you give the drug while the tumour's still on board, give these immunotherapy drugs while there's more tumour on board, it's much more likely to have a stimulus effect on the immune system than what it is if you get rid of the tumour and ask it to mop up cancer cells.
So anyway, what's the concept behind it? So adjuvant, as I mentioned before, was an adjunct. So you have your surgery, you can see the patient with the melanoma, they have the knife, they have their surgery, and then after the tumour's removed, you give 12 months of adjuvant immune therapy. So the patient never actually knows whether it's working because the tumour's been removed. We do scans regularly to look for recurrence, but you don't know that it's worked unless it's failed, unless the scan shows the melanoma has come back. Whereas with neoadjuvant, we give the drug first, and it does multiple things. Number one, then we resect. So we give only 6 weeks of drug therapy. Then the surgeon will resect the specimen, and then the specimen gets sent to the pathologist. And so it is very multidisciplinary. I, as the medical oncologist, select the drugs for the patient. The surgeon removes the tumour, and then the pathologist will look under the microscope to feed back to us as to how well the patient went. And we stratify their response based on the looking down the microscope as a complete, near complete, partial, or no response. What is amazing is that patients love it because knowledge is power. Knowing whether you're responding or not, rather than the top line where you actually don't know, can really have a major impact on your quality of life and your level of stress and anxiety. But what's more is that patients who have a complete or near complete response, I'm able to say to them as a medical oncologist, you are very, very unlikely to ever recur. And this is the data from the 2 phase 3 randomized trials.
Yeah, which is truly incredible, the improvement in outcome for patients if they get the same amount of drug, but
less.
Well, in the initial trial, which was done in America, they did compared patients who had the same drugs. In one group of patients, they had 3 doses before surgery, then received the same drugs afterwards, and another group who had the same drugs but had it straight after surgery, and there's this massive improvement in outcome by getting the drugs beforehand. So this is the curve on the left, which makes it very exciting, but we've taken this a step further.
So these are what we call Kaplan-Meier survival curves. I'm sure most of you know what that is, but just in case. So on the left, you have the percentage of people surviving on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, you have time. So at the start, everyone's alive and well. This is about recurrence, not survival. So how many people recur? And you can see the blue top curve is everyone who got the drug first, and the red curve is everyone who got the drug after. And you can see a massive difference in how patients went simply by giving the same drug, the same number of doses, but giving 3 doses before. And when you tease out that blue curve and separate it by complete or near complete, because this is everyone, they basically flatline. They stay up at 1 the whole time. We don't have any recurrences. This is what we call a phase 2 trial. That means it's a smaller trial. It's not as statistically powered. And so we went and did a phase 3 trial, which started around the same time. And we looked at neoadjuvant combination immunotherapy versus exactly the same. The red curves are actually exactly the same type of drug. We did not give 12 months of treatment. We only gave 6 weeks of treatment to those that had that major good response at surgery. And so despite not getting 12 months of treatment, if you get 2 doses and show a really good response, you practically don't recur. And I think I've got those curves here, yeah. So this is that second trial. So the top green curves are people who had a major pathological response. I'm just going to show you here. And in fact, that was 60% of every patient, 60% of the total trial had this major pathological response and rarely recurred. And if we look at their survival, it's 100%. This is just time to recurrence. So this is absolutely a game changer. 2 doses only, not 12 months of treatment. It impacts quality of life. Patients love it because they know they're going to do well. Or the flip side, you know that you weren't responsive. So it's an opportunity to change the treatment. And that is power. Knowledge is power for the patient who's undergoing this treatment. I think I just highlighted those 3 points. Refined prognosis, we can tailor their treatment, and we can also tailor the scan. So if you've had a good response, all of a sudden you don't need 3 monthly scans. We can stretch them out to 6 monthly immediately. That has a benefit for the patient. It also has a benefit for us health economically. We're paying less for scans we just don't need to pay for.
Or treatment can stop. So we're saving money on drugs as well as scans. Yep.
Richard, do you want to talk about the path?
Yeah, so this is some data from that trial. Each vertical line is an individual patient. Up the top is their pathological response. So the ones in dark blue or purple, they had 100% response. The light blue is 90%. So as Georgina said, all of those patients, virtually none of them had a recurrence. So along there, light blue, there's only 1 patient who recurred after a good pathological response. So this has enabled us to perform some first in the world research to understand why this is happening. We can look at patients who haven't responded, try and work out why they haven't, and therefore define ways perhaps that they can be treated to improve outcomes. But anyway, one of the features that we found was there's a particular type of response when we look down the microscope, this fibrotic response, which seems to indicate, if you see that, these patients are the ones who are going to have incredible outcomes.
And what does the fibrosis mean?
It means that the body's immune response has been incredibly well stimulated and has got rid of the tumour, and where the tumour was, it's been replaced by fibrous scar tissue. So the immune system's doing a good job.
Healing tissue. So just a few quick slides on glioblastoma. Richard was diagnosed with glioblastoma over 12 months ago. It molecularly, when it was characterized, was very poor prognostic glioblastoma. And if you had to summarize it in the red box there, it had all the worst features for a glioblastoma. And the standard treatment, which was first developed in 2005 or published in 2005 and became the mainstay, was basically surgery first to maximal safe resection. You can never resect all of these tumors. They have long tentacle and branches that branch into the brain, followed by chemotherapy and 6 weeks of radiotherapy, followed by more chemotherapy to a total of 6 months of treatment. That was the standard treatment.
Well, I can't help myself but pitch in, but 20 years ago that was developed, and that treatment improved survival by 2 months, and it remains incurable. It was incurable, new treatment, standard treatment, average survival 2 months longer, and still everyone dies.
So that's the average survival. But there are a small number of people who can survive a long time, beyond 10 years. There is a small number with that treatment. So when Richard was diagnosed, he was in Poland and I was in Sydney, and I started to think about what would I want to give to this sort of tumour if it was a melanoma. And not that this is routinely available. And I came up with a plan of neoadjuvant, but it required buy-in. I am not a cowboy. I'm a trialist. I think up drugs. I work hard. I have a chemistry background. I know my drugs. But in medicine, if you're going to do anything that's outside of the box, you absolutely must have support and a proper research ethics and governance structure around you. And so there was 3 people who were key in this coming up with the plan when I presented it to them. One was Brinda Shivalingam, Richard's surgeon, who, when Richard arrived about 5 days after the seizure from Poland and we were in the hospital room, she said, I have been waiting 10 years to do something like this. And then Helen Rizos, who was the lead scientist, who was very keen on making sure we had all the plans for the experiments we were going to do following that. Because if you're going to do something like this, you must collect data and you must show that to the world and publish that data. And then the other thing I did was to start thinking about the clinical trial once Richard had got through the first part of the treatment, and that was in September, which we hope to open within 2024. But the treatment was very novel. It was a triple, very toxic regimen of immune therapy because Richard's tumour did not have any immune engagement, and then followed by adjuvant or mop-up treatment afterwards, along with a vaccine that Helen and I designed with another small company. That photo is just on the Tuesday, literally 36 hours after Richard's seizure, and that has the head of biobank, another medical oncologist, and Helen on the computer. So we really got into gear very quickly to try and enact or implement the plan that I thought might help, but we don't know.
No, I can't thank my wife, Katie, enough for all she did during that initial period to support me and help facilitate these interactions and allowed all this to happen, because standard treatment would be surgeons get in early and try and remove the tumour. And
so what I'll just quickly show you is the comparison of the biopsy before. There was an open biopsy before the drug therapy and then at the resection to maximal safe. So at the top is the baseline before the drug. The bottom is post-treatment. And the basic thing to look for are these brown dots, which you can't see at the top. They're not there. And you can see, and these are what we call immune T cells. So CD3, CD8, and lots of CD4. And we've done a whole heap of experiments, which we call high-plex spatial analysis, flow cytometry on what we call dissociates. So they're parts of the tumour that are taken out immediately and grown out on a Petri dish, single-cell sequencing, TCR sequencing, and neoantigen analysis.
I'm just going to say, we've got the president of College of Pathologists of Australasia
Oh,
here in the audience. We can ask him to interpret those slides for us.
So that's just a small part of what's been done so far. But Richard, what else are we doing?
Coming back to immunotherapy, we know that the fecal microbiome, so inside your gut, the bugs that are sitting there can affect your response to immunotherapy. So we've shown that certain types of bacteria can be associated in your gut, can be associated with a better response to immunotherapy and a reduced risk of getting toxicity from immunotherapy.
And we actually did this transcontinental study. So Australia, the Netherlands, and the US. And basically, orange is bad and blue is good. And the Netherlands far outstripped the US and Australia. Australia's flanking and the US flanked the Netherlands. And the US, regrettably, have a very poor diet. And you can see there in orange, high fats, lots of McDonald's, et cetera.
But just before we go on, Georgina, just to add one thing, microbiome is not the be-all and end-all. Overall, the response rates in Europe, Australia, and US are similar. And it's probably a small percentage of patients where it does have a big impact, but it's not massive in all patients.
So that's the real take-home message. It's very complicated and it probably has a small impact on a small subset of patients. Helen Rizos and her work with liquid biopsy, very important part of our research program.
I love this particular case because I think you might have been the clinician involved, Georgina. This is a patient who had melanoma. They've got a tumour spread or metastasis within their lung. You can see it at baseline, how big it is, attached to the base of the lung. They started on immunotherapy, and then at 12 weeks, the tumour had seemed to have grown a bit. And this was in really early days, one of the first trials of immunotherapy. And thankfully, the therapy had persisted, or its effect persisted. And then 6 months later, you could see the tumour was shrinking down. So the effectiveness of this therapy. But when we look back at the circulating tumour DNA, so DNA that's coming from the patient's tumour that we can detect in a blood sample, you can see it was falling from the very start. So that was a better test to identify response to therapy than X-ray scans are. And this is now something that we're starting to integrate into routine care.
Most people, though, you do see the scan and shrinking. It's actually quite unusual for it to grow first and then shrink. But it does demonstrate the point that we can use multiple things to predict how a patient will go into the future.
I guess another example of why research is so important and it can change the care of patients.
I think this is our second last slide. This is something we're very proud of and we're working hard on. Richard mentioned that diagnostic test in terms of diagnosis of melanoma early on, because that sets the train for how a patient will be treated and managed. But we're also looking at how best to match a drug therapy and applying it to neoadjuvant as well. We're quite far advanced with these reports based on the patient's tissue and their clinical information, and it enables us to select out those who can go ahead with our blue standard treatments, or those who may need to go on clinical trials up front while they're really well. Because going on a clinical trial is not an easy thing for the patient and for the whole team. So we need people to be in the best fitness possible. So that's what we're working on now. And we hope to actually use this in a clinical trial to put people into clinical trials, because we're going to predict that they're not responding well to our standard treatments.
We've got a great team of people that we work with at Melanoma Institute Australia, many of whom are in this photo here, and we've presented work, the two of us doing it, but the truth is it's done by an amazing team of people, and we can never thank them or be proud enough about what they do to contribute to the field.
Australian patients are incredibly, enthusiastic to make a difference and contribute. And often I'll hear in clinic so many times, I want to do this, not just for me, yeah, it might help me, but to contribute for generations. Whether the trial is going to be a negative trial or a positive trial, people want to contribute and make a difference.
Selfless
and that is
and generous. That's
wonderful. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard and Georgina, for being here today and for that terrific presentation that shows us the power of research, the power of collaboration, multidisciplinary teams working together and brave experiments. So we really thank you for coming. For the audience to know, we kind of snuck in on Richard and Georgina's tour. They weren't expecting to come to us. So we really appreciate them squeezing in, presenting to us. We've got more than 90 people online as well, and obviously a huge group in the room. So it's terrific to have you here. Now, I need to look to people who are with you to see if we have time for questions. We do have a little bit of time. So I will open it up to the room. If you don't mind, Georgina and Richard, please take a seat, and whether or not anybody in the audience has a question. Don't be... Oh, yes, Mark.
Thanks for your talk. Absolutely no hyperbole of what you're saying. I've been in medicine for 40 years. Any of the therapeutic agents you develop, any of the IP, so reports, financial reports coming back?
That's a great question. The drugs to date, so the big ones that are on the PBAC, were developed by pharmaceutical companies that then sold it to larger pharmaceutical companies. So in terms of the IP for the drug therapies, the ones that are available on the PBAC, no. However, moving forward, there are some drug therapies where we have a greater stake in the interests of how they're developed. One thing that Australians are not good at, and this is something Richard and I were discussing at the American Chamber of Commerce, is recognizing, particularly universities, they're getting wise to it. Universities are getting wise to it, but how do you recognize the intellectual input and manage conflicts? As a nation, we haven't got comfortable with that, which is very different, for example, to the innovative, very innovative corner of the US, the northeast corner around Boston particularly, where they've been able to manage how you can manage the conflicts of interest where you're inventing something or you might be diagnosing at the same time, like a diagnostic test and you're diagnosing. Australians haven't been able to put the framework together yet to make that happen, but we have to, because that's how innovation happens. When people see the fruits of their labor impact, they feel more encouraged to do innovative things and stay in Australia to do it rather than move overseas. So what you talk about covers so many different topics that we could delve into, but intellectual property and conflicts of interest is something we're working through right now. And it's great to see that universities are waking up to this to find a better way to manage that so that we can be more innovative.
Can I just pitch in with two additional comments? So I certainly, we've seen a change at the University of Sydney over the last 2 years, particularly related to this melanoma diagnostic test that we've developed based on whole genome sequencing data that's first in the world that we initiated. But the other thing I wanted to add was about a year ago, Georgina and I put in a submission to the PBAC about the use of neoadjuvant immunotherapy that the PBAC, the Australian government's paid pharmaceutical benefit scheme, that you could, that they're already paying for adjuvant therapy. So when you give the drug after the tumour's been chopped out. But by this data that we presented today, we'd seen that if you give the drug before surgery, it's more effective and you don't need to keep going in some patients. So it's improving outcomes and saving dollars for Australian taxpayers. So as I understand it, we're the first two clinicians to put into the PBAC to get a drug approval in a certain way, and it's benefit patients and Australian taxpayers. So we're very proud of that.
So the PBAC being the pharmaceutical benefits basically scheme, the committee put together by government to review data and agree that drugs should be put on the PBS, the scheme, so that every Australian has access to those drugs. And the evidence required for the PBS to list a drug is high. And so it should be, because we want to be safe. We want to treat drugs with drugs that are effective and that are safe. And so we were the first to put a drug and not be a big company based on that data. And what we were really proud of is that PBAC responded beautifully. They were so practical. And there are only 2 countries where this is approved, Ireland and Australia. And the Netherlands have just come on board and approved that drug for their country. So now in fact, I'm working with the PBAC and TGA right now for the combo where we only give 2 cycles. That's a little trickier because those drugs aren't available in that setting and it's not just swapping, but that's what we're working on. So I think we've got a great system actually that's safe and really focuses on Australians as a community and not individuals.
And the confidentiality about the costs involved negotiated between pharmaceutical companies and the government benefits all Australians. We get cheaper priced in Australia than many other countries. No one knows exactly what it is, but definitely that's the feeling that I get when I get asked to go to these meetings. I can see there's some other questions.
Yeah, there's one up the back and then I have one online. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Georgina and Richard. I thought it was just a fantastic talk. I was actually, I think it segues nicely from what you were just talking about, whether you could actually just talk us a little bit through, so presumably the way that you got Richard to have that experimental treatment was through compassionate access scheme, or could you just talk us through that a little bit, and also just whether you think the regulatory environment in Australia is working for us in some of these cases where we do see very poor prognosis, and your thoughts around that sort of issue. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got the most amazing system. For people with a prognosis of less than 12 months, we have a system with the TGA where a medical oncologist in cancer or whoever the specialist can submit to the Therapeutics Goods Association a treatment that they would like to give, but it has to be based on science. So Australia is very lucky. That system is really special and it cannot be broken or damaged, because it does give an opportunity when you have a terminal condition. Within science, though, it has to be the paperwork, it has to be drugs that are well known in terms of their toxicity and have some data about them. You can submit to the TGA. If you were in the Netherlands, you could not do this. If you're in the US, you could not do this. They do not have that infrastructure, but it is strictly, it has got very strict criteria about it. So the regulatory system for that is pretty impressive, and us Australians need to protect it. It can't be abused, because that's when red tape starts to, you've got to have the right governance. So at the moment, it's about the data that gets submitted to the TGA and the level of toxicity data, etc. So you can't say, I think cockatoo poo mixed with methylated spirits is a fantastic drug, and submit that to the TGA and then inject it into the patients. In fact, your license would be revoked, and so it should be. We've got to have the right governance and ethics. So we do have that small opportunity for terminal illness. The thing that I did when Richard was diagnosed is I trolled for a clinical trial. I'm a trialist. That is going to be my number one go-to. And there weren't any trials suitable. Richard was in a unique position in that he did not require steroids. He'd had a seizure, a big seizure, but there were lots of factors that meant that going to surgery immediately was not needed. In fact, he got on a plane and came home with that.
And also, Brenda was on site, the surgeon who I'm personal friends with, so she knew what we knew about in melanoma, the rationale for going down this path. To be honest, it did take a bit of Georgina put on the table for me, given that data that I already knew about, that contributed to
zero convincing.
Yeah, it was no for me to do this.
And the reason is because she's worked with me in brain melanoma that goes to the brain for over a decade. And she'd seen the revolution that had happened there. Like I didn't show the data, but it's incredible. These are people with multiple melanoma brain metastases, so melanoma that's spread, literally gone in about 56% of them. So she'd lived that and knew what is possible. And so she was she was right on board. In fact, she emboldened. You need your medical colleagues as the person prescribing this and coming up with, you need that support.
Well, I was just going to say that and for me as a patient, having contributed to the data that was being used for Georgina to put this plan on the table, it's a no-brainer for me to go down this direction, because I've seen the data, been involved in it. But to get a team of people on board, apart from Georgina and Brenda, did take some work. And again, I can't thank Katie enough for what she did in supporting me and putting together some letters to finally get a group of people who are all on board to go down this path. And average time to recurrence with the tumour is 6 months. I'm now out to 15 months. Average survival is 14 months. So I'm past that. But people were scared like nothing else, that this was going to knock me off earlier, or I'd be left with, stay alive, but be left with side effects, which would make the quality of my life terrible. But we know this field, so
there's one caveat that we have to say. Richard's one patient, and that's not evidence.
Yeah, of course.
That's an anecdote. And Richard and I have discussed this. Richard's survival might seemingly be above the average, but we don't know the natural history. Yeah. We really don't know the natural history.
You need a clinical trial to show whether or not a drug therapy works. And
so this is not the magic bullet. It is not by any means. And the data we're publishing is about the impacts on the tissue and the immune system. It's not about the survival, because we can't count on that. It may be the natural
On
history.
one patient, yeah.
We're both science, medical people, so we
But
can
the
have
thing
these
that we can be
discussions.
proud of is the
in terms of-
science that we've generated has blown open a potential area of the field that hopefully will improve outcomes for future patients. Fingers crossed.
We have one last question online. The question is, exercise therapy during adjuvant and neoadjuvant chemoradiotherapy for large organ cancers have been shown to attenuate treatment responses. Would you hypothesize that the same could occur during immunotherapy for melanoma?
Sorry, what was the question?
Exercise therapy during adjuvant and neoadjuvant chemoradiotherapy has been shown to attenuate treatment responses. And what do you think about exercise therapy? Could it
Sure.
occur the same for immunotherapy of melanoma?
It should undergo the same rigorous scientific exploration as any other intervention. And in fact, there are trials that we're doing with some of the exercise physiologists at Sydney University, where patients will, the leg thing, where they go like that before their infusion. There's a whole heap of work about timing of the infusion, timing of the day. There's a whole heap of things that can be explored. They're very difficult to actually test and be confident about the results. So designing the trial to prove your hypothesis is the key in the right population. And so that's where the work is. It's like painting a room. The work is actually sanding back and preparing the wall before you actually paint. So it's all in the design of the trial to check your hypothesis. But of course, it is a hypothesis worth looking at. I do think things like the microbiome, exercise, time of day of infusion, these are things around the periphery. They don't have the same impact as biologically understanding your targets and going for them with a drug therapy, but they all count. And if you can line all those ducks up, you may have a better outcome, but it's a very reasonable hypothesis. We still have to sort out optimal dosing with immunotherapy. This is something that the whole cancer field faces. Last week, I was in Naples for the inaugural Innovate Think Tank conference on neoadjuvant immunotherapy. The leader in breast cancer, head and neck, lung, melanoma, and breast cancer, one other cancer, GI cancer, were there. And one of the things that we have to work on now is these chemotherapy, immunotherapy combinations. Because in the mouse models, people will say, oh, they're very synergistic, but we have not proven that in humans. And actually, chemotherapy does the very opposite of what we're trying to do with immunotherapy. So we wonder that when you combine all of them, you get a big improvement initially, but you're not curing as many in the long term. So that's something that the field has to face and really work out.
That makes total sense. Chemotherapy suppresses the body's immune system, and when you're giving immunotherapy, you're trying to stimulate it. So giving those two drugs together doesn't seem right.
And some cancers will not do well with one immune therapy. I would never give a one single drug to certain melanoma patients. We use multiple combinations for certain types.
Yeah.
So the same principles should be applied across cancers, and each cancer will need to work that out.
And before we sign off, just one last thing about immunotherapy. In melanoma, as you know, 95% of them are caused by ultraviolet radiation. The tumour mutation burden in melanoma is off the scale compared to most other cancers. So there's more what we call neoantigens on the surface of the cancer cells. So the immune system can be activated against it. If you can get rid of those blockages that are stopping the immune cells from getting in there, it's going to be more effective. That's what we've seen in melanoma. The chances of it being so effective in cancers with much lower tumour mutation burdens are a lot less. So brain cancer being one of them.
And there's a lot of melanomas that have low tumour mutation burden that we've been able to cure with the right combo. Yeah.
Look, thank you. I'm sure I don't want to hurry you. We could listen to you all day. It's terrific that you've squeezed us in. As I said, thank you on behalf of the School of Medicine, on behalf of Menzies, the broader college and the university for coming and speaking to us today. It's terrific work. We're incredibly proud, not only as an alumni, but as Australians of the Year for the work that you've done, and it is inspirational for everyone here today. So thanks so much, Georgina and Richard.
Thank you.